Welcome back to Question Period. 2025 was a pivotal and alarming year in Canada-U.S. relations. The return of Donald Trump to the White House brought with it a trade war, and threats to Canada's sovereignty. The stark turn for the worse in bilateral relations led to Prime Minister Mark Carney openly eulogizing a U.S.-led international rules-based order. But what does that mean for the security of Canada and more broadly the globe? Jake Sullivan served as former U.S. President Joe Biden's national security advisor. Hi, Mr. Sullivan. Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for making the time.
Really appreciate the opportunity.
As we outlined there in the introduction, things certainly have changed in the world with Trump version 2. Do you agree with our Prime Minister's assessment that the traditional rules-based world order guided by U.S. moral leadership, however imperfect that may be, is over?
I do agree that we've reached the end of the post-Cold War era, and a new era is coming into view, but the shape of it, I think, is still contested and not entirely clear. So to that extent, I agree with the Prime Minister. Where I disagree with the Prime Minister is that he effectively equated, not just under President Trump, but for the long term, the United States and China. Not in so many words, but that was the basic implication of his presentation. And I think the U.S. and Canada have such deep interests and communal ties and a very long border that we have to find a way to have a deep and sustained relationship, even when we hit difficulties like a president in the United States who, claims Canada's the 51st state or starts a trade war or whatever it may be. So it did concern me a bit that Prime Minister Carney painted with a very broad brush.
I have a few questions for you about China actually coming up, but I did want to follow up just on that. Would I be correct in interpreting that as you don't believe this drastic change in the relationship is permanent, that there might be changes, but that ultimately it's not, a hard break?
Look, just as the world will look different in the future, I think it's right to say the relationship will look different in the future. And the Prime Minister, I think, very fairly laid out many different ways in which the world is changing and evolving and what we're having to contend with on everything from the technology revolution to the climate crisis to the rise of China, which is a massive event in geopolitics over the course of the past several decades. So things will change and therefore the relationship will change. But do I believe that it is the end of a positive, deep, sustained alliance between the United States and Canada to the mutual benefit of both our nations? I do not think that is inevitable, and I think that that would be a very, very negative outcome because the U.S. and Canada living side by side with one another, benefiting from each other economically, socially, in terms of national security, this has been a fantastic dividend for our peoples, and we have to find a way in new forms with new modes to the relationship to move forward. And that doesn't at all erase the current challenges or difficulties, and I'm not trying to whistle by the graveyard on those, but it does take the long view. It takes the long view about what is fundamentally in the interests of both the United States and Canada.
What kinds of things do you think could be key in the coming years to seeing what you just laid out materialize?
Well, first, I think that the United States and Canada have many reasons to deepen their supply chain integration so that we sustain a vibrant industrial base in the technologies of the future, in clean energy, including electric vehicles, in biotechnology, in artificial intelligence and the compute power that's going to be required to drive the artificial intelligence revolution. I think in all of these areas, economic and technological integration between the U.S. and Canada will be profoundly important. And then in the changing security landscape, there's just no getting away from the fact that we inhabit the same North American continent, and that we have to find a way to think about the evolving security threats that we face, including a growing nuclear threat from the People's Republic of China, and find ways to ensure that we're defending our people effectively.
So what would you say to Canadians who understand on the face of it what you just said, particularly around, for example, new technologies and deepening the security relationship, but feel very nervous about that given the type of rhetoric employed by the president, in particular with respect to our sovereignty? Even if we take away the tariffs and all that stuff, just the rhetoric around our sovereignty, Canadians are nervous, I think, about, it's fair to say, and polling supports that, about deepening that part of our relationship while Trump is there. What would you say?
I would say I get it, and I want to be very clear. I think if I were a Canadian citizen listening to the head of state of another country basically question whether my country had a right to exist, to be a sovereign independent state, I would have a very, very hostile reaction to that. So I completely understand it. I also understand not just that general reaction, but the more specific substantive response that was embedded in the prime minister's speech, which is, look, we can't put all of our chips on one number on the roulette table, because the United States has shown that it could at any point decide to weaponize the interdependence that the U.S. and Canada have against Canada. I get that too, which means diversification. So I think the way in which Canada has chosen to try to deepen its economic ties with the European Union, with India, with other democratic nations around the world, that is a totally logical thing. It makes sense to build up a set of partnerships with others. And in fact, it makes perfect sense to continue to have an economic relationship with China. The United States has an economic relationship with China. But I think what I am just pushing back on is the idea that there should be a permanent break in the U.S.-Canada relationship. As I said, I think it will have to change and adapt and be updated for the realities of the moment, and to take into account what we've seen over the last year. But I want to just keep coming back to what I think is the big picture, which is there is so much good in what our two countries can do together down the road that I hope we continue to try to achieve that, even as Canadians rightly look very seriously at how to respond in a strategic way to what they're dealing with right now.
I did also want to ask you about China, because I remember covering your visit. I think it was to a cabinet retreat. I was in Halifax for it. It was at the time that the federal government here was announcing, the previous government was announcing those tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. I was interviewing a minister a few days ago just about sort of this government's pivot on China, and she insisted that China right now is more predictable and intimated, easier to deal with than the United States, as a kind of justification for some of the changes in policy with respect to the auto sector or even the oil and gas sector. I wondered if what your thoughts are on whether that's an accident or whether that is by design, that China is positioning itself that way in light of the moment we find ourselves in.
Well, I'm not going to disagree, in fact, that China is a bit more predictable right now than what we are seeing come out of the White House. But being predictable isn't inherently a good thing. One of the things that is predictable about China is that if a country does something that China takes offense to, China will react in ways that are coercive, that weaponize their supply chains and their interdependencies. And Canada has just quite recently gone through that experience. And so from my perspective, it is, again, perfectly logical to have a relationship with China in trade and economics, as the United States does, as basically every country in the world does. But buyer beware from how deep to make that and how much to rely on China, because they have already demonstrated with an authoritarian system that is prepared to take quite brittle and coercive actions against democratic countries like Canada, that they have done that in the past, and they very well could do it in the future as well. And so from my perspective, it just means being, proceeding with caution. The other point is that China has a very predictable industrial strategy. And it is a strategy to try to build up and capture the dominant share of many of the industries of the future, including electric vehicles, with state subsidies and other forms of support that undercut competition in places like Canada. And so left to its own devices, China, in fact, would flood the world with cheap manufactured goods and essentially drive industries entirely out of business in other places, including in Canada. So there is a logic to the U.S., Canada, Europe, and others having some countermeasures to make sure that China does not, in fact, become the sole manufacturer of many of the advanced technological products in the world, that we sustain robust industrial bases in our countries, and that Canada does so for itself. So for those reasons, I think it makes sense to have a economic relationship with China, but to proceed with caution in doing so.
Would you have kept those tariffs on?
I would have kept the tariffs on. I think that those tariffs made sense. They are matched by tariffs on electric vehicles in the United States and many other countries, Brazil and Turkey and India and others. In fact, even the European Union has tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So from my perspective, that made sense. But look, it's not really my place to Monday morning quarterback, as we
For sure.
as we say down here on this side of the border. to Monday morning quarterback a prime minister's decision on a tactical trade arrangement that involves opening the Chinese market to Canadian goods. I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I think in general, a level of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles makes sense, both for security reasons and for economic reasons. But I also understand why Canada has decided to hedge here.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Sullivan, a real pleasure. Thank you for making time for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.